Hi, and welcome to Coffee, Murder, and Chill. My name's Carlina. Grab your coffee, true crimers, and get ready for some chilling true crime. Today we will be talking about the Gainesville Ripper, also known as Danny Rolling. He was an American serial killer who killed 5 students in the beautiful town of Gainesville, Florida, as well as 3 people out of Shreveport, Louisiana, and he also attempted to murder his father as well. To understand the events that took place, we need to start from the beginning. Now, throughout this podcast, you will see me glancing at my computer. That is because I am reading, because it's a lot of information. So, Claudia married James when she was 19 years old, and she found out that she was pregnant 2 weeks after marrying him. James got very angry by this because he did not want to have children, and he began beating Claudia. During the pregnancy, Claudia had left James, but she returned to him shortly after. On May 26, 1954 is when Claudia gave birth to Danny, and there were some complications during the delivery, and they had to use forceps to deliver Danny. When Danny was born, the verbal abuse from his father began, and it was when Danny started crawling that the physical abuse started due to James not being happy with the way that Danny was crawling. Claudia became pregnant with her second son, Kevin, and once Kevin was born, the abuse on Danny got worse. Now, Claudia once again left James, but returned shortly after, with James pleading for her to return. After returning to James, there were several incidents that took place, including James tying up Danny on 6 different occasions across a 6-month span. James also found a puppy at work and had brought the puppy home, and Danny got attached to the dog. Well, according to numerous witnesses, James would, on more than one occasion, beat and torture the dog. He had beat the dog and tortured it so badly one day that the dog actually passed away in Danny's arms. Now, James was not an affectionate person, and he believed that giving hugs was a sign of being a sissy. Now, once again, we're at another point where Claudia left James due to his violent behavior, and it didn't last long before they got back together, and this went back and forth a few more times. In 1963, Claudia suffered from a nervous breakdown when Danny failed the 3rd grade due to missing too much school from being sick. The school counselors described Danny as having anger issues and poor impulse control. Danny was supposed to see a counselor, but never did. James continued to abuse Danny, Kevin, and Claudia, even slapping Danny for not knowing how to use the clutch while teaching him to drive a car. In 1965, Danny walked in on his parents fighting and witnessed his mother slitting her wrist and locking herself in the bathroom. His dad broke down the door and continued to beat Claudia. Claudia was committed into the hospital after that suicide attempt. Now, at this point, Danny would try to stop James from beating his mom, but it only made the abuse worse for Danny. Around this time, Danny started with his alcohol problems. And Danny used to wait until his parents were asleep, and he would sneak out of the house as a way to get away. He wound up peeking into families' windows when he saw the family sitting down eating dinner and doing normal family activities, which enraged Danny because he didn't have that normal home life. This started a string of incidents where he would peek into people's windows and watch them, and then it turned into more of a peeping Tom situation where he would actually be pleasing himself while watching people through their windows. Danny had a long criminal history from a teenager to a young adult, from burglaries and watching women getting undressed. Now, on June 28, 1971 is when Danny joined the Air Force, but in 1972, Danny was arrested for drug possession and disobeying orders. So he ended up losing a stripe, and he was diagnosed by a psychiatrist with a personality disorder, and he was forced to leave the Air Force under honorable discharge. Now, when Danny returned home, he began to get more involved with the church and church activities. The doctors concluded that he was sane and sent him back to the Montgomery County Jail. He was caught trying to escape again and sent to the hole for several weeks. On June 7, 1984, Danny was released from the Alabama prison, and he returned to Shreveport to see his mother and father. In November of 1984, Danny broke into a young girl's home after watching her for several hours. His intent was to rape her, but she started crying and he felt bad. So he decided not to rape her, and instead they talked, had a cup of coffee, sang songs to each other, and then engaged in consensual sex. She took him home, and then he fled town in fear that she would call the police. On January 15th, 1985, after traveling around between family and friends' homes in several different states, Danny went back to Shreveport to see his daughter. Danny continues his strings of robberies and spent some more time in jail. Now, during all these years, Danny is still dealing with the idea that he would never be good enough for anyone. And no matter what Danny did, he would always lose. His breaking point was on November 4th, 1989, when Danny was fired from work. His boss claimed that he had missed 3 consecutive days at work, and when he was confronted about it, he exploded in a fit of rage and threatened to kill the manager and the cook. On November 6, 1989, the bodies of 3 victims were found. Julie Grissom, who was 24, her father Tom Grissom, and her nephew Sean, who was only 8 years old. The medical examiner estimated that the time of death was 2 days prior to the day that Danny Rawlings lost his job. Now, you'll hear in a couple different documentaries, if you've followed this case before, they believe that him getting fired from his job is the reason that he went and killed these people. But according to the medical examiner, he killed these people 2 days prior to losing his job. On May 19th, according to the medical examiner, he killed these people 2 days prior to losing his job. On May 18th, 1990, Danny got into a fight with his father, and he shot James once in the stomach and then once again in the forehead. On June 2nd, 1990, Danny broke into the home of Michael Kennedy and stole 2 handguns and the identification papers of the deceased Michael Kennedy Jr. July 22nd, 1990, Danny took a bus to Sarasota, Florida, and it was there that he began his transition into Michael Kennedy Jr. August 23rd, 1990, Danny Rawlings checked into a local hotel under the assumed name. August 23rd, 1990, Danny Rawlings checked into a hotel under the assumed name Michael Kennedy Jr. He set up camp in a wooded area within 2 miles of all his crime scenes, which was close to the University of Florida, which is located in Gainesville, Florida. In August of 1990, he burglared the apartment of Christopher Osborne, stole his car, and drove towards Tampa, Florida. This is where he burglared several houses and a convenience store, leaving a trail of evidence behind. August 24th of 1990, Danny broke into the house of 2 college freshmen, armed with an automatic pistol and knife. He covered the mouth of Sonja Larson with duct tape and stabbed her to death. August 24th, 1990, Danny broke into the house of 2 college freshmen. He was armed with an automatic pistol and a knife. He covered the mouth of Sonja Larson with duct tape and stabbed her to death. He next taped Kristen Powell's mouth and bound her hands behind her back. He removed her clothes and fondled her. He forced her to perform oral sex on him and then raped her. Next, he stabbed her 5 times, killing her. He returned to Sonja's body and raped her again. He fled their apartment, throwing all evidence in a dumpster. While riding away on his bike, Danny began to feel ill when he found the girl's nipple in his pocket. August 25th of 1990, Danny broke into the home of Krista Hoyt, 18 years old. She was not home during the time as she worked a day job at the police station, so he waited for her to return. Once she returned home, Danny attacked her, taping her mouth shut and her hands behind her back. He raped her. Then he turned her over on her stomach and stabbed her in the back. He then fled the scene of the crime and went back to his tent, where he realized he had lost his wallet. So he returned to the scene of the crime, where he decided to behead Krista Hoyt. He sat her body upright on the edge of the bed. He laid her nipples beside her, and he placed her head on a shelf across the room, positioned in a way that she was looking at her own body. This was the most violent crime that Danny committed, and it is believed that that is due to the fact that Krista Hoyt had a very close resemblance to Danny's ex-wife. August 27th of 1990, Danny broke into the apartment of Tracy Pauls and Manuel Taboda and killed both. No mutilations to these bodies. It's possible that he was interrupted before he could mutilate them. Now, after killing his victims, Danny would clean the bodies up and then pose the bodies. It is believed that he did this as a form of pleasure. August 28th of 1990 is when police began their surveillance of Edward Humphrey, the suspected killer. Danny narrowly escaped arrest on bank robbery charges. As Danny was sharing a campsite with Tony Danzy, Rolling ran from the police. They discovered his campsite upon the pursuit, and they found a number of items linking him to the murders, as well as a bag of cash that was covered in pink dye. August 29th of 1990, Danzy threatened to call the police on Rolling, so Rolling made plans to flee the area. August 30th of 1990, Christopher Osborne found his apartment broken into. August 31st of 1990, there was thousands of students that left Gainesville, and 700 of them did not return out of fear of being murdered. September 1st of 1990, Tampa resident Larry Lawrence and Holly Paula found their apartment broken into. September 2nd, a Tampa Save and Pack was robbed. September 3rd, Danny Rolling assumed the identity of Jesse Lang. September 8th, 1990, Danny stole another car and headed for Ocala and attempted to rob a Winn-Dixie supermarket. While forcing the manager at gunpoint to empty the office safe, the store's bookkeeper called police from a phone that was in front of the store. Police arrived as he pulled out of the lot and a high-speed chase began. After crashing his car, he fled on foot to a nearby office, and this is where police arrested him. Now, at this time, they had no idea that Danny had anything to do with the murders or were linked to the murders in any way. Now, September 12th of 1990, the Gainesville Ripper story made the front page of every newspaper. January 1st, 1991, Rolling ripped a toilet from its mounting and threw it across the room. His defense attorney asked for a psychologist test and moved to withdraw the guilty plea on Rolling's armed robbery charges. October 1991, Danny was convicted of 3 Tampa burglaries and sentenced to 3 life terms plus 170 years. Now, during this time of Danny being in prison for the burglaries, the authorities in Gainesville were still investigating the strings of murders that took place, and they kept hitting dead ends. They found a person of interest, which was Ed Humphrey, and they held him for 5 months. He was an 18-year-old freshman at the University of Florida and was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ed had anger issues and was arrested after an altercation with his grandmother. Now, during this time, there was this lady by the name Cindy Geraci who was from Shreveport, and she heard about the murders and she immediately thought that Danny Rollings was involved in the murders. This is due to the 3 murders that took place in Shreveport before Danny fled. Now, at the time that she was putting in the tip to the police, the DNA came back and was found not to be a match for Ed Humphrey, so he was released and cleared of all murders. The officer that was investigating the robberies asked the person that sold Danny a gun in Tampa if there was anything odd or different about his behavior or anything that made Danny stand out compared to other people, and the guy had told the officer that Danny was missing a finger. During a briefing, as they were explaining this specific detail, an officer made the connection that it had to be Danny based off of a paper towel that they found at one of the crime scenes. Now, on one side of the paper towel was an imprint of a penis, and on the other side there was a handprint that was missing a finger. This is an important part due to Danny having an accident at work one day that resulted in him cutting off a piece of his finger. It is believed that he used a paper towel to clean himself after he finished with one of his assaults. So they decided to run the DNA from the crime scene to each person in the prison system, and found it to be a match for Danny Rawlings. So on November of 1991, Danny was now linked to the Gainesville murders as well as the Shreveport murders. In May of 1992, Danny was sentenced to life plus 30 years for the first Union Bank robbery. In May of 1992, Danny attempted suicide several times and was sent to the psych ward of the Florida State Prison. In June 1992, Danny had started correspondence with a woman named Sandra London from prison. Now, also in June 1992, Danny was charged with the Gainesville murders while he was in prison. Now, in February of 1993, Danny announced his engagement to Sandra London. In August of 1993, Danny wrote Making of a Serial Killer with Sandra London. February 1994, Danny pled guilty to 5 murder charges. And in March of 1994, the jury recommended 5 death sentences. Also in March of 1994, Danny's father beat his mother and threw her out of the house, and she died shortly after that. In April of 1994, Danny apologized to the court for the crimes he committed. In April 1994, he was sentenced to death. March 1997, Danny's appeal was rejected by the Florida Supreme Court. And in October of 2006, Danny is executed by lethal injection right before his execution. Danny wrote a letter confessing to the 3 murders in Shreveport. I think it's important to note that as I spoke of Danny's past and how he was brought up, one, that he was diagnosed with a personality disorder, but also that Danny had significant trauma in his past. He was beat. His dad made it known that he was never wanted. You know, his dad told him time and time again from birth that he would never amount to anything. He would never be good at anything. So it's speculated that Danny wound up killing the 3 people in Shreveport, Louisiana, and figured out that he was good at what he did. And so that is the reason that he continued to do so. He got a thrill out of it. He figured out, hey, this is something that I'm good at. This is something I can succeed in. And so he continued to do it. So that's the story of Danny Rawlings, also known as the Gainesville Ripper. I want to thank you guys for listening. All show notes will be posted down below for everything that I've mentioned in this episode, where I got all my information from. Make sure you tune in next week as we dive into the case of the Hog Trail Killer. Also, make sure you subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any new episodes. Thank you for tuning in to Coffee, Murder, and Chill.